Hey friends! Welcome back to the Animal Nerd podcast. I am, as ever, your vaguely human host, and today I'm going to be taking you 100 years into the past to explore the story of a hippo who became an international celebrity when she decided to do what no other hippo had done before. I know, I feel like every episode starts off with me introducing the animal as something along the lines of an international celebrity, but it's true! There are so many stories of animals who became famous and were reported on around the world during their lifetime, only to end up being forgotten in the sands of time, and to be honest, I think that's kind of sad. I think there are plenty of people out there who would get something positive out of these stories, if only they heard them, and I guess that's a big part of what this podcast is about. And so today, I'm going to share with you the story of Huberta the Hippo. Although before we get into the story proper, I do just want to include a quick disclaimer that this story takes place in South Africa, and therefore there are a lot of place names that were unfamiliar to me before researching for this episode, and which obviously stem from languages which I don't speak. I've done my best to research the proper pronunciation of everything, but I'm still aware that I may not pronounce them correctly, even if just because I obviously have a very non-South African accent. And if I do mess up with any of them even slightly, then I am really sorry. I don't mean any disrespect at all. I'm absolutely doing my best, but I'm not at all perfect. So yeah, with that out of the way, let's finally get into Huberta's story. It's a little difficult to tell you where Huberta's story begins because her early life isn't documented. She wouldn't become famous until her adulthood, and prior to that, she was just like any other wild hippo. So we don't really know a whole lot about her. All we really know about Huberta's early years is that she was probably born in the St. Lucia estuary in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, but we don't know when. This area, which is now mostly encompassed by the Isimangaliso Wetland Park, is still a haven for wildlife, and hippos in particular. It's actually now the third largest protected area in all of South Africa, and is home to the largest population of hippos in the country, about 800 individuals who are regularly found roaming the streets of the town, so perhaps it's not surprising that Huberta came from here given the things she would go on to do. Because Huberta's past is so murky, we also don't know exactly when her legendary journey began, but we do know it was in late 1928, around October or November time. Huberta, for whatever reason, decided to leave her home and cross the Tugela River, travelling across South Africa. She was first noticed properly on the 22nd of November, when she decided to stop by a sugarcane farm in the village of New Gelderland, which she seemed to view as more of a roadside cafe. The next day, an article about Huberta's raid on the sugarcane farm was published in a local newspaper, along with a photograph taken of her the previous day. And this would end up becoming pretty significant, as it's actually the only photo taken of her when she was alive. Initially, this newspaper actually dubbed her Billy. It wasn't until later that she would receive the name Hubert, which is the one that stuck. And yeah, neither of those are the names that she's known by now. That's because at the time it was just assumed that this hippo was male. It wasn't until after she passed away that they discovered the famous Hubert was in fact female, at which point she was pretty swiftly renamed Huberta. I did consider referring to her as Hubert for most of the story, since that's what she would have been known as at the time, but I thought that would just be confusing, so we're sticking with Huberta. And I know what you're thinking. Why was a hippo hanging out around a farm newsworthy? It's not like wildlife eating farmers' crops is an uncommon occurrence, it's something that happens to every farm in every country. Well, that's because hippos just don't live in this area of South Africa. Once upon a time, their range had encompassed more or less the entire country and beyond, but that was before European colonisation. So when Huberta suddenly appeared in an area that hadn't been home to a single hippo for multiple decades, well, it's safe to say that she stood out. Of course, once people in the area heard about Huberta, a lot of them wanted to go and see her for themselves. But Huberta wasn't one for the limelight. Hippos are large, dangerous animals, but they're also generally pretty shy, and Huberta was no different. She would typically hide out during the day and emerge at night, which is very normal for hippos even when they're not being sought out by crowds of noisy admirers. But that's also why we don't really know much about Huberta's journey. She was followed wherever she went by journalists and fans, but despite that she was very good at losing them and travelling under the cover of dark. As you can imagine, being a wild animal, Huberta wasn't massively keen on how many people were flocking to see her, so before long she decided to travel further south, further away from her home. And she found her next spot to settle down for a while in the swamps around the Umvoti River. This area was apparently less populated, and so she was able to find some peace here. But Huberta did really seem to have a case of wanderlust, because it wasn't all that long before she was on the move again, and in March of 1929 she arrived in the area surrounding the town of Umhlanga, now about 200 kilometres from where her journey began. And she really seemed to like it here because she stayed for quite a while. Of course, she continued to be followed by journalists and enthusiasts, but Huberta remained an expert in avoiding unwanted attention, hiding away in the swamps and dense brush during the day. She was actually very rarely seen during this time. Mostly people only knew she was about because of the footprints she left behind. As Huberta travelled, so did word of her mysterious journey, and she became so popular that some of the people who came to try and get a glimpse of her would bring treats like sugarcane and fruit, perhaps to try and lure her out, or perhaps just to show their love for her. For a lot of people, hearing about Huberta's exploits was a fun distraction from their daily lives. 1929 was the first year of the Great Depression after all, and people around the world were struggling because of the economy. People wanted escapism, and Huberta offered that to them. But for some people in South Africa, it went much, much deeper than that. Huberta wasn't just a light-hearted distraction, she became an important spiritual figure. Although many of these people believed that Huberta was a reincarnation, exactly whose spirit inhabited her body varied between different communities. To the Zulu, she was King Shaka. To the Mpondo, she was a famous traditional doctor, and to the Xhosa, she was a great chief who had come to get justice for his people. And it wasn't just indigenous people who revered Huberta either. South Africa then, as now, had a decently sized Indian population, most of whom were Hindus living in KwaZulu-Natal, and to a lot of them Huberta was a protector of the poor, apparently even being deified at a local temple. To all of these groups, she was a sacred being deserving of the utmost respect, but unfortunately not everyone saw it that way. Huberta was continually hounded by journalists, and would sometimes get so annoyed by the constant harassment that she would apparently chase photographers up trees. But that's not the worst of it. Some people who came to see her, rather than bringing treats, would come armed with sticks, stones and bottles, throwing them at her to try and force her out of wherever she was hiding. And then there was also a team of people from Johannesburg Zoo, who were sent out to try and capture Huberta and bring her back to live out the rest of her life in captivity. They already had a female hippo at the zoo, but no male, and thought that Huberta, who was still assumed to be male at this point, would be the perfect mate. And no doubt they also thought that having such a celebrity at the zoo would bring in more visitors. But like I keep saying, Huberta was a master at avoiding people and managed to escape being caught, and eventually, because of her fame and how beloved she was, the Natal Provincial Council named her as royal game, which meant it was illegal for anyone to hunt or catch her, so at least Huberta would no longer have to worry about being shot or shipped off to some zoo. As was always the case with Huberta, she didn't hang around for too long before she resumed her travel. She continued south until she reached Durban. Durban is today, and I assume it wasn't too different 100 years ago, the largest city in KwaZulu-Natal, and the third largest city in all of South Africa, so if Huberta was trying to avoid humans, she wasn't doing the best job of it. Her time in Durban seems to be the best documented period of her journey, and I'm guessing that's because more people around means being seen more. Although by this point she was also at the height of her fame, which I don't doubt would have helped. Because Durban is right on the coast, it's a popular tourist location. And on the 1st of April, Huberta decided to join the holidaymakers, and went for a stroll along the beach and a swim in the sea. It must have been so frustrating for the people who saw her that this happened on April Fool's Day. If you tried to tell anyone what you'd seen, they'd probably just assume you were making it up. But this did really happen. Personally, I like to think Huberta deliberately did this on the 1st of April just to mess with people. Huberta was also known to sometimes come right into the centre of town at night, waltzing down the main streets as though she owned the place. Huberta also perhaps had a bit of an anarchist streak in her, as one night she trampled the garden of the local police station, and another time she decided to visit a luxury golf course and did a pretty good job at churning up the ground. There was also an occasion where a party was going on at the Durban Country Club, and Huberta decided to invite herself along. I mean, you really can't throw a party without inviting the world's most famous hippo, that's just rude. And okay, maybe I'm anthropomorphising Huberta's motives a little, but let me have some fun, eh? I mean, you can't technically prove that Huberta wasn't an anti-establishment icon. While Huberta certainly seemed to have fun while she was in Durban, it wasn't enough for her to stop her wanderings, and before long she was off again. Though rather than travel all the way through the city, she instead backtracked a little and then detoured around it. Her journey continued along the coast in much the same way as it had before, taking a break every now and then when she found a particularly secluded lagoon, crossing roads and rivers, passing towns and cities, and being followed by the press pretty much wherever she went. In January 1930, she wandered right into the market square of Port St John's. And I've got to say, there's something about large wild animals refusing to respect human boundaries that I just adore. I mean, I know it can be dangerous, but goddamn is it cool. So, remember how Huberta was named royal game, and that meant she couldn't be hunted or captured by anyone? Well, yeah, it turns out that wasn't necessarily the case if you had the right paperwork. And in February 1931, Bloemfontein Zoo were awarded a licence which granted them permission to catch Huberta. Or at least to try and catch her, because as I've said multiple times already, Huberta was something of a master at avoiding people, and the more they tried, the better she seemed to get at it. And this time was no different. Despite the zoo's best efforts, they were unable to get their hands on Huberta, and she remained a wild animal, free to go wherever she pleased. And where she next pleased was a town called East London. By this point, Huberta had left her home province of KwaZulu-Natal well behind her, and was now in Eastern Cape. For an animal who seemed to spend so much of her life hiding from people and avoiding attention, there were also times when she just really seemed to not care about people whatsoever. Probably one of the best examples of this comes from the 8th of March, when Huberta decided to take a nap on a railway line. Just lying spread out on the train tracks without a care in the world. She didn't even react when a train came along and sounded its horn. She was not even remotely bothered. The train had what's known as a cowcatcher on the front of it, and for those who are as clueless about vehicles as I am, a cowcatcher is basically a sort of triangle-shaped thing on the front of a train. Basically, trains, especially back then, could be easily derailed or damaged if they hit something that was on the tracks, so the cowcatcher was supposed to basically just shove everything that shouldn't be there out the way. You know, stuff that shouldn't be there, like an entire freaking hippo. Fortunately for Huberta, the train's driver had seen her in plenty of time, and so had been able to slow the train enough that by the time it reached her, the cowcatcher didn't throw her to the side and hurt or potentially kill her. Instead, it just sort of gently nudged her, and she still didn't seem to care much. Although this did seem to be enough to wake her up, and she slowly sauntered off, more than a little annoyed to have her beauty sleep interrupted. It's just so bizarre, like, of all the places to take a nap, why train tracks? I mean, I know hippos have padding, but that can't be comfortable. Regardless though, Huberta was unharmed, and that's the important thing. Although, unfortunately, that didn't last long. Look, I know I keep repeating this, but it keeps being relevant to the story. Huberta was good at hiding from people, and so it wasn't uncommon for her to seemingly vanish for periods of time. So I suppose no one thought it was strange at first when Huberta disappeared not long after the train incident. She was a wild animal after all, and a nocturnal one at that. As far as I can tell, there were no more recorded sightings of Huberta for over a month, until the 23rd of April, when her body was found in the Kaiskama River. She was dead. Two things soon became clear. The first was that Huberta had died several days ago and had been lying there all that time, waiting to be found. The second was that this was not natural causes. She had been shot a total of 6 times, with 2 of the bullets going straight into her brain. People were horrified, furious, heartbroken, not just in South Africa but across the world. Huberta had been a celebrity, the nation's pet, and now she was gone. Someone had killed her. Her death was reported in newspapers across the world, and her mourners sent sympathy cards, wreaths and flowers, and wrote poems to express their grief. Huberta's killing caused such an outcry in South Africa that it was even discussed in Parliament. In the KwaZulu-Natal town of Verulam, which has a primarily Indian and Hindu population, flags were flown at half-mast in her honour. The day after Huberta's body was found, the director of Amatole Museum, Captain Guy Shortridge, along with his assistant Nicholas Aarons, rushed to the scene of the killing. With the help of a couple of farmers, they skinned Huberta's body, and the day after that both her hide and her skull were returned to King William's Town, the last town Huberta had visited, and the location of the Amatole Museum. Once back at the museum, Huberta's remains were further cleaned and worked on, and already there were crowds of people gathering, eager to see anything of the hippo who they'd all come to love. There were so many of them, in fact, that they trampled the museum's garden and brought down a fence, which I'm sure the museum weren't too pleased about, but I don't know, I think it's kind of a fitting tribute for an animal who trampled so many gardens in her lifetime, really carrying on her legacy of accidental carnage. Huberta was famous for her ongoing journey. In the 3 or so years she'd been known about, she travelled over 1,600 kilometres, travelling through at least 122 rivers in the process. And Huberta's travel didn't end with her passing, far from it. The furthest she ever travelled was after her death, when her remains were sent all the way to London to be stuffed and mounted. And I mean London in England, rather than East London in South Africa where she'd been before. She was transported by boat and then stuffed by a master taxidermist. It cost £159, which was obviously way more back then than it would have been today. But the museum didn't have to worry much about the cost of mounting Huberta's body. Earlier I mentioned how people sent in flowers and cards after her passing, but they also sent donations of money to go towards the cost. People loved Huberta and they didn't want to say goodbye to her. But there was something far more important than preserving Huberta's body, and that was solving the mystery of who was responsible for her death. At first, people apparently assumed that it must have been natives who killed her, despite the fact that there was no evidence to suggest such a thing. In fact, all of the evidence available pointed to this being the action of a white farmer, but then again, when have racists ever cared about getting their facts straight? I'm sure there were plenty of theories and speculation being thrown around as to who had killed Huberta and why, but it wasn't until almost a month after her body had been found that 3 men turned themselves in and confessed to being the ones responsible, although they claimed that they'd had no idea who Huberta was, or about her protected status. Or at least one of them did, a farmer in his 60s. He was illiterate and spoke only Afrikaans, and as a result, the news of Huberta and her journey had just never reached him. There were actually 4 men involved in total, but I'm not sure if they all pled ignorance as to Huberta's identity. I'm going to assume they probably did. 2 of the men were the farmer's sons, and I have no idea if they could read or write or if they spoke other languages, but I'm pretty sure if they'd heard about Huberta, they'd have mentioned it to their dad before deciding to shoot. Especially as if they'd heard about her, they'd probably also know that she was royal game, but I don't know. There aren't many in-depth accounts of the trial online, and none of them really go into detail on that. Even if they didn't know exactly who Huberta was, though, they still knew that she was a hippo, a species that no longer lived in the area. That was why they killed her. They wanted to, I guess, be able to sell her body to the museum, so she could be displayed there. It feels like a very human reaction to seeing something so incredible, to immediately respond with violence and greed rather than awe and respect. They did give a more in-depth statement on how they hunted and killed Huberta, but I'm not going to go into detail in this episode. It's not pleasant. This was not by any means a quick, painless death. Huberta would have suffered horrifically over the last day or so of her life. All 4 men were found guilty on the charge of killing royal game, and each were fined $25. Obviously that was worth a lot more back then, but it still seems a pittance for such a senseless killing. Huberta may no longer be alive, but her journey continued on. Of course, her hide and skull had been sent to London to be mounted, and then returned, again by boat, to her homeland. And there had been a lot of talk about what should happen to Huberta's remains. Pretty much every town she'd visited wanted to be the one to keep her body, but perhaps the most vocal in their supposed right to her remains came from Bloemfontein Zoo, who argued that because they'd had a license to capture her, that meant that they had the most right to her body. Never mind that they'd never actually succeeded in catching her. Ultimately, though, it was decided that Huberta would remain in King William's Town. As well as being the place of her death, it was also they who had paid for her to be mounted. But before being put on permanent display in Amatole Museum, Huberta had one last journey to make. She was exhibited at various museums, each one for only a short period of time, so that as many people as possible could see her. First, she went on display at Durban Museum for about a month, during which time over 20,000 people came to see her in person. Then she went to East London, where, again, hordes of people flocked to see the body of the legendary nomadic hippo. She also had a stint at a show in Johannesburg before finally returning to her new home of King William's Town. And that's where Huberta's journey finally comes to an end. Well, mostly. In 1999, she spent a week on display at a science festival where, once again, she attracted a crowd of thousands. But other than that, Huberta has remained in pride of place at the Amatola Museum, where she still is to this day. In the years after her death, Huberta's story has been immortalised in multiple books, mostly children's stories, and she's continued to be a popular figure in the areas she roamed. It's been nearly 95 years since Huberta first left her birthplace and started on her journey, and in all that time, one question has remained. Why? Why was she travelling? Where was she going? And I'm sorry to say that that question has never been answered, but plenty of theories have been posited over the years, as you might expect. One of these is that Huberta witnessed her mother being killed by hunters, and she was just trying to get as far away as she could, scared and traumatised. Another theory is that she was searching for a mate, perhaps a specific individual that she'd known and lost. There's also what's probably the least likely but most romantic theory, that she wanted to revisit the land of her ancestors. Some, if not all, of the areas she travelled to were once inhabited by hippos, but they were wiped out some 50 or 60 years before Huberta's journey. While Huberta herself would have been too young to remember such a time, even in the wild, hippos can live to be between 30 and 50 years old, sometimes as old as 60, so perhaps she'd known an elderly hippo who'd been born in those lands, or perhaps she had some kind of deeply buried instinct to go there. Or, who knows, maybe the Hindus or locals were right all along and Huberta's journey was fueled by something far more spiritual in nature. I don't know. No one does. But feel free to let me know what your theory is. Is it one of the ones I mentioned, or do you have a different one entirely? As ever, all of our contact info and social medias will be in the show notes if you want to reach out. If you haven't already, it would mean the world if you subscribed or followed this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and gave us a nice review, or a mean one, I guess, if you hated it, although I'm not sure why you'd still be listening if you did. Please feel free to check out the Little Rescue Zoo. It's an animal sanctuary I'm involved with, and any money this podcast makes will go directly to them. So if you want to know more about that, the links will be down below, as will my sources for this episode. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. So thank you so much for listening today. I'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, and until next time, stay wild, friends.